Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So you've got me for about 8 minutes, and I'll be setting the context of the British Library's Antiracism project. And then, as you've just heard, I'll pass on to Alan, who'll focus on the work that was done around cataloguing and metadata. The first slide that you're about to see shows gives a tiny bit of background on the anti-racism project. As you can see, we set up a pan-library working group shortly after July 2020, and over 90 colleagues from all levels across all areas of the library were involved in this. It was very much a project to put in place a step change, or almost a generational change. So we as an organisation became a lot more representative and a much more diverse organisation that is both welcoming and empowering for everyone who either works with us or engages with us. And it was very much a grassroots project. And to be quite honest, we had a lot of very challenging conversations because, as you can imagine, there's some very difficult subjects that we covered, and many of us were listening to voices that hadn't really been heard for quite a while, or if not often. And so it was a really, really good project, a really good start. And we're now in the process over the next few days of transitioning to a point where it moves from being a grassroots project to being one where senior leaders are taking on the responsibility for delivering the work through what pulls together all of the recommendations in a race equality action plan. And the idea there is that the plan will list measurable, concrete and lasting change and lasting things that we can do. And as you can see on the right-hand side are the different subgroups. And what I'm going to be doing, the staff were divided into, what I'm going to be doing is talking at a very high level about some of the recommendations from 5 of those subgroups, and then I'll hand over to Alan, who will focus on the cataloguing and metadata one. So the next slide shows the audiences subgroup and shows some of their recommendations. And by audiences here, we meant people who engaged with us in any way, whether that's visitors to the library or indeed people who were using our services, or as you can see from the first point, people who weren't using us or who aren't using us at the moment. So one of the first recommendations which we're taking forward is to actually look at our non-users. Why aren't people using us? What are the things that we can change as a result to increase our users and to diversify our users? We think it's really important to work with people to produce things for the things that people will be engaging with us on. So increase the amount of community-led or co-curated, if you like, programming that we do. Also make sure that the content that we deliver in terms of exhibitions, the project teams include diverse voices, and also there's diversity in the delivery and planning of those. And actually that the displays themselves and the exhibitions themselves also include diverse voices. It's very, very important there that we introduce all our users to as much diversity as possible. And the last point here is about making sure that our interpretation doesn't shy away from some of the difficult things that we're aware of, whether that is about provenance that we discover of our items, or indeed whether it's just about giving people warnings about where some of the things that they are going to encounter might be difficult to engage with. So that's the audiences. The people and HR policies subgroup came up with a range of recommendations. Here are just 4 I chose from the list. An obvious one, which is sign up to and implement the principles of the Race at Work Charter. There's a really big one, which is actually look at all of our policies and processes through the lens of equality and diversity, and see whether there are things that we can change in there to encourage us to get a more diverse workforce, which moves on to the next point, which is that we need to look again, and we are looking again at all of our recruitment and selection processes for staff, but equally importantly, when staff are in the organisation, ensuring that there is equal access to all the development opportunities and promotion opportunities for staff so that people can move up the organisation and move into different positions, but especially senior positions. And in some areas of the organisation, we will be setting targets to improve our BAME, which is an acronym meaning Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic representation. That's still a controversial term, and we're looking at changing that as well. Moving on to the next subgroup. So this subgroup was basically looking at what is the research and insight and data that we need in order to keep on going along this trajectory. Again, a host of recommendations. I've just pulled out 3 here. One of them is making sure that all our recommendations and all our work going forward has a baseline measure that we can then develop key performance indicators against. So that has involved gathering data. We now also need to identify the data that we need to gather moving forward to be able to allow us to monitor progress and actually propose areas of improvement. And then we are going to be publishing annual reports on our progress. The next slide is the area that I, as a senior member of staff, am taking responsibility for now, which is collections and curation. And mirroring some of the discussion that we had from the last speaker, these are some of the areas that have been proposed and that we're taking forward. So one is doing provenance research, and I'll be very happy to discuss how we're thinking of doing that, because obviously you can't research everything at the same time, but we do need to do a lot more provenance research. When building our collections for others to use, we need to find a way of working much closer with communities and with people we're building those collections for. But that doesn't just extend to exhibitions, as we've heard, but also how you build the collections. Also, ensuring that we become much better at engaging with people out with our staff in all the activities that we do. So one of the things we're looking at is how we can make that more explicit within curatorial roles. There's a very specific deliverable here around Black studies. So what we are doing moving forward is looking at how we can support the subject, the academic subject of Black studies in universities, and making sure that we are very clear in signposting people who are interested in that to the resources that we provide, whether that's through connecting or through collecting. And then finally, making sure that we publicise all of the work we're doing in all of these areas. And the last slide from me is around behaviours, values, and experiences. And put simply, one of the groups was basically looking at what should we be thinking about in terms of the staff experience and the user experience and the value sets that we use. The first recommendation that I've chosen here is that we need to understand more about the kinds of experiences that staff have in this area, and run surveys which then will generate more recommendations going forward. We need to also make sure that there are sufficient networks and ways for staff to speak to each other and support each other, and so that we also as an organisation find ways of continuous improvement and continuous learning. Then there are a couple of points I pulled out around values, that we need to find different ways and new ways of reinforcing the organisation's values and having discussions about those. And one of the suggestions here is to use the individual staff performance review as a mechanism for that. But alongside that, we should also think about whether the value system and the well-being models that we use are the best ones, or whether we could learn from other types of value systems and models that are used across the world, not just necessarily in Europe and North America. And there are some people who are particularly interested in that as an angle and area to take. And finally, we need to just reassure ourselves and look again, you can never do this enough, at whether we have the right mechanisms in place, the procedures, and people understand them, and the policies for dealing with racism when we do find it, whether that's on site or online. So that's it from me at a very, very high level. I'm now going to hand over to Alan.
Thanks, Xerxes. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to go through in slightly more detail, but not very granular detail, the recommendations made by the library's subgroup on cataloguing and metadata. So the subgroup set out its own purposes, which were to understand and expose the extent and impact of discrimination and bias in the library's cataloguing practices and metadata, to facilitate the development and enhancement of descriptions, interpretations, and presentations of collection items, and to collaborate with colleagues involved in these areas of the library, and to learn from best practice beyond the library to make recommendations to enhance the safety, inclusivity, and accessibility of the library's collections for all potential users. The subgroup, like all the other subgroups, was drawn from across the library and had staff members in all grades and types of experience who weren't by any means all catalogers or metadata experts. There were many staff who were users of the catalogue and users of the metadata, or who had a very fresh perspective on these things. And so we set out the scope of the subgroup as follows. We had a very broad definition of metadata as the information that we record to describe, contextualize, manage, and preserve our collections. And then we made some broad recommendations, or we had some broad areas that we were going to explore for the as the work of the subgroup. There were ambitious information gathering tasks which we actually knew were beyond the capacity of the subgroup to conduct, but which could be carried forward as recommendations to the future project. And I'll go into those recommendations shortly. We obviously consulted widely in order to find, or we intended to consult widely to find out what people's perceptions of the metadata and the catalogues are, where the hotspots are, all of those kind of things. And we had an objective of making ambitious recommendations that fulfills the library's responsibility as a significant international institution, and that set an example on how to embed an ethical metadata approach. So outcomes from the work are three very broad objectives covering metadata, access and discovery, and the policy and principles. I think the other important outcome was that the group was very clear that we needed to make a case for resourcing, that we have to communicate the importance of cataloguing and metadata to the production of knowledge and to the presentation of cultural heritage for the diverse community that the library serves. We also need to make it clear that within the existing resources, there's insufficient capacity to deliver everything that's being recommended, and that additional resource will certainly be necessary in order to do so. So the objectives that we set ourselves under metadata included, these are sort of, again, broad descriptions. The intention of establishing a comprehensive glossary of inclusive terminology to support a multifaceted collections audit. So in order to actually work out where all of the issues with our metadata and catalogues, etc., are, we really need to do an audit. In order to do the audit, we have to understand what are the terms that are problematic and need to be addressed. once we've done that, we can create a flexible approach for treating that problematic terminology, ensuring that descriptions are contextualized and accurate, and ensuring that users are able to experience the catalogue and the website safely, and warning them where necessary of the potential for discriminatory and harmful content. For access and discovery, we're going to look at how we can develop more flexible subject terminologies and discovery approaches. As was mentioned in the previous presentation, outdated and inappropriate language certainly occurs in some of our legacy collections. And how do we bypass that? We don't create all of our own terminologies. We use terminologies such as Library of Congress subject headings. How can we avoid some terminology in those standards that we may feel are not appropriate to the UK audience? We also want to surface under-described and undiscoverable collections. Has there been unconscious or even conscious bias in the way in which things are relegated to backlogs or cataloging backlogs and those kind of things? So we need to look into, as Xerxes was saying, we need to look into all of our previous assumptions about what's important and what's not important. We also want to look at the potential of adopting access protocols for culturally sensitive heritage, and I've got an example of how that might work later on in the presentation. And we also want to improve discovery of marginalized experiences in the collections, and that will be through the creation of collection guides, finding aids, blogs, and social media, as well as increased targeted and fuller cataloguing of resources where possible. Perhaps the most important aspect of the work will be to inculcate cultural change by embedding ethical principles in cataloguing, education and training within the library. And we'll also provide support to staff engaged in working with sensitive or disturbing content. Ethical training should be regularly updated in line with other types of mandatory training within the library. So there are actually 10 specific objectives. I'm not going to go through these in detail because we don't have time. But the key takeaway from this is that almost all of them are high priority. So at the moment, I'm trying to think about dependencies and which ones we should be working on as the highest priorities. But I've picked out a few to just give you an illustration of the kind of things that we'll be doing. So one of the most important and kind of foundational tasks is to establish this glossary of problematic and inclusive terminology. And what I've put on this slide is an excerpt from the Inclusive Terminology Guide and Glossary produced by Carissa Chu, who was working at the National Library of Scotland at the time that she created this resource. And as you can see, it provides a set of terms and puts them in historical context, suggests alternative terms that could be preferred, provides some tags that would help to identify these terms, and also relates them to the Library of Congress subject headings where possible. We expect to develop this as we examine our own collections and catalogues over the next couple of years or so. We also need to implement a system of advisories by which users are made aware of the existence of terms or images in the library's website, content or catalogue records that may cause offence or distress. And this is something that we've made some proposals about, but nothing has been implemented so far. And the subgroup certainly felt strongly that we were somewhat behind the curve on this. Many other institutions have already done this. This is an illustration here from a project that the library is engaged in called True Echoes, where you can't actually access the website until you've read the advisory notice. And then once you have read the advisory notice, you can access the website, and you will have been warned that there may be things that you may find distressing. So what we are looking at is a system that can go from the general to the very specific, so that we can have something at the top level on the library's website or the library's main catalogue, and then something that's more specific to individual catalogues or collections. We want to explain to people why we have terminology within our catalogue or in our content which they may find offensive. So we need to put things in context. We also want to respect the resources in our collection. So we're not planning to censor things. We are planning to adjust our metadata, particularly where the curatorial voice of the 19th century is no longer acceptable in the 21st century. We're also aiming to be responsive to users. So we want to put it, we already have some mechanisms in place whereby users can comment on cataloging issues, and our metadata quality team will deal with those. But this is something slightly different, and we need to put in place mechanisms whereby we can deal with these kind of queries. And we need to put in place some kind of oversight, such as the ethics board that was mentioned earlier, that would think about ethical questions that might arise from these user feedback. We're also looking at the ethical principles for cataloging and metadata, from which we would then update and maintain policies and practice, policies and processes. As Xerxes mentioned, the library has a code of values, and we've done some work to align those with existing ethics codes. Specifically, we've looked at contextualizing our code of ethics with the International Cataloging Code of Ethics that was published last year. And we've looked at some more granular examples from the Archives and Records Association Code of Ethics. So the next steps, as Xerxes said, senior managers are drawing up plans on how to implement the proposed recommendations, and we will be, from a metadata perspective, we'll be incorporating the actions into our collection metadata implementation plan for next year, and also for the next collection metadata strategy. And obviously there will be a British Library Race Equality Action Plan, into which some of the activity will also be factored. I've provided some links at the end if anyone wants to follow up on any of those aspects. So thank you. And also